Bravely Default 2 is a love letter to classic JRPGs, and when it's at its best, it feels like a perfect modernization of what made games like Final Fantasy V great, instead of just retreading the material that these decades-old JRPG classics already tread. Unfortunately, the game doesn't always live up to this lofty standard, so let's look at where the game excels and where it could have been better. Starting with the story, for any longtime RPG fan, the narrative of Bravely Default 2 will feel comfortably familiar. A calamity is coming, and the heroes need to collect 4 elemental crystals to save the world. You'll spend the bulk of the game going to 4 major cities, solving a problem, and collecting a crystal. Most of these chapters are well done in isolation. I particularly liked Chapter 4, which centers around what happens when a character that's basically like the Pope goes a little mad with power. The trouble is that while the chapters are individually well done, they feel very disconnected from each other. You'll spend about 8 to 10 hours on a given chapter, and there will be maybe a couple cutscenes that are relevant to the broader narrative. As a result, the last few chapters where things start to come together feel rushed and aren't as engaging as the early chapters. The game also has a lot of interesting ideas that don't really go anywhere. The game's antagonist for most of the game, for example, is introduced early on in a very interesting way, but you won't directly engage with him after that for another 25 to 30 hours. So instead of having an antagonist that I was champing at the bit to fight, I ended up not being terribly interested in him when the time came for the climactic battle. Similarly, the game has a series of objects called Asterisks that the party is hunting for, and these are the objects that open up new job options mechanically. The stones are made out to be a big deal in the story, and they're part of why one of your party members is with you, but there's really nothing to them besides being magic MacGuffins that make you more powerful, which feels like a bit of a missed opportunity. All in all, the individual chapters are fun and engaging, especially in the first 30 hours of the game, but the last few chapters feel like they just kind of crawl across the finish line instead of ending with a bang. What makes up for some of the weaknesses of the narrative, though, is the game's charming writing. All of the characters in the party are very likable, and the writing and voice work had me laughing at multiple parts during the story. The lovable cast goes a long way in keeping you engaged, even when the story is spinning its wheels. The game's presentation also serves the story and narrative well for the most part. Cities and dungeons are beautiful and evocative of an interesting fantasy world. All of the cutscenes are fully voice acted, and most of the actors did a great job. My only complaint about presentation is that I'm not a fan of the chibi art style that they used for the characters. It clashes with the rest of the game's excellent presentation, and it just isn't the improvement I was hoping for when the series moved from 3DS to Switch. That said, I did love that every job came with a unique, cute little outfit for each character, so that's a big plus in terms of presentation. There's more to a game than just its story though, and the Bravely series is most known for its gameplay. And that's no surprise given the unique system present in Bravely Default 2. Combat in this game is a turn-based system with a twist in the form of the Brave and Default system. Instead of having the defend action you would see in a typical turn-based RPG, characters have the option to default. This increases their defense and skips their turn in exchange for 1 Brave point. Next turn, you can use the Brave command to spend a Brave point to take an extra turn. This makes defending a much better strategic option than in most RPGs already, but what really makes this system tick is that even if you don't have any Brave points, you can go into debt, taking up to 4 actions in a single turn. Of course, you do have to pay that debt back in the end, so if you go 3 turns into debt, that character won't be able to take any actions after they take their 4 extra turns. The result is a system where players are encouraged to take calculated risks. If you think that you can burst down an enemy, you can always go ahead and go into debt on every character to try to finish them off, but if you're wrong, the game will punish you hard, as you'll have to watch the enemy wail on your units for 4 turns while they can't do anything. You feel like a genius when your strategy works, and it generally feels fair when you get punished for getting it wrong. Enemies can also Brave in Default, which makes the game's boss battles the highlight of the game. You have to be strategic in boss encounters because if your party gets too low, the boss can always take 4 turns out of nowhere and wipe you in a single burst. The result is that bosses in the early to mid-game feel like strategic battles of attrition, where you have to figure out the best way to hurt the boss while also managing both your Brave points and the boss's. Compounding the Brave and Default system is a robust job system. Bravely Default 2 has 24 jobs for players to mix and match. You only start with 2, but it's not long before you have a wide variety to choose from. Each character can have a main job and a sub-job, and also has 5 passive slots that you can equip passives they have that they learn from each job they level up. It's a really versatile system that lets you combine jobs in unexpected ways for powerful results, and you'll want to switch between different job loadouts for different bosses for most of the game. Towards the late game, the system starts to break down a bit as there are some truly busted builds out there. One I discovered was a class combination that let me paralyze bosses with a 100% success rate, and once I discovered that, I never had to change party composition for bosses again unless I wanted to. But that wasn't until the last 15 hours of the game. The game is at its best in the first 4 chapters, where it feels like different job combinations are needed for each boss. Most bosses before Chapter 5 took me 2 or 3 tries as I experimented with building the right team for the job, and it felt super rewarding once I finally got it right. The only issue that holds the gameplay back is unfortunately poor quality of life. Bravely Default 2 is a game about switching jobs and building teams. This means that you'll frequently be changing your equipment and your passives when you build a new team with new jobs. This gets tedious really fast. Something like a loadout option where I could create preset equipment and passive sets for each job would have gone a long way towards making switching jobs seamless instead of tedious. The game does offer a recommended equipment option, but I found that this often made pretty poor decisions, so I didn't consider it viable for most of the harder bosses in the game. The job system can also be a little grindy as each one has to be leveled up separately for each character. It doesn't take that long to level up any one job, but if you want to hit max level on every job on every character, it's gonna take a while. But if you just want to get through the story, you won't have to grind much, especially if you do all the game's side quests. The only problem is that the side quests in this game are really bad, like some of the worst that I've seen in a modern RPG bad. Most of the side quests in Bravely Default 2 are just talking to an NPC who will ask you to kill a few of a certain enemy and then come back. And I don't even mean that they boil down to that, that's what they are. One of the early quests is initiated by talking to an NPCs that just tells you they hate goblin archers and asks you to go kill 3 of them. Every so often you get a good side quest that either has a bit of story or pushes you to explore a new place, but most of them are very dull. Only 3 side quests are required to beat the game though, and they're 3 the good ones, so if you don't want to do the dull side quests, they are completely skippable. The last part of Bravely Default 2's gameplay that I want to touch on is the game's card game minigame, B&D. It's a territory building card game with loads of opponents all around the game's world, and I really liked this card game to the point that whenever I got into a new town, I would run around looking for people that I could play cards with instead of actually saving the world. This also suffers from some quality of life changes. I don't understand why they made it so you can only use a card in one deck at a time, or so that if you lose a card, you can't win it back from the person you lost it to, you have to go find the person you initially won that card from. But overall, the gameplay for the card game's really fun, and I appreciate that the rewards for the card game aren't relevant to people that don't want to play it. So if you hate card games, you're only going to have to play a couple games of B&D to unlock an asterisk related to them, but if you really like card games like me, there's a solid 5 or 6 hours of gameplay here for you to enjoy. Overall, Bravely Default 2 is an inconsistent experience. The first 35 hours or so are when the job system works best, and you need to make strategic decisions to engage with the game's mechanics to succeed. And if I was just grading the first 2/3 of the game, I might give it a B+ or A-. Unfortunately, the game breaks down a bit in the back third. The narrative fails to build to an interesting climax, and the job system becomes easy to break instead of something you have to think critically about every time there's a new boss. With all that in mind, my final grade for Bravely Default 2 is a B-. It's worth a play if you're looking for a modern twist on classic JRPG games, but don't expect a memorable narrative and be aware that the encounter balance lets the game down towards its finish. If you like this video and you want to see more content like it, consider hitting the like or subscribe button. I also stream every Saturday at 11 a.m. CST at twitch.tv/BadgerBarian, so check that out if you're interested as well, and have yourself an awesome week.